Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar. Climate change, South Asia's biggest threat. Climate change is arguably the defining global crisis of our age, and one region is on the front lines, South Asia. In recent years, South Asia has been the world's most disaster-hit region, with extreme weather having a devastating impact. Climate change has exacerbated the frequency and severity of floods, storms and heatwaves, causing human casualties and displacement, food and water shortages, and economic losses. What makes South Asia especially vulnerable to extreme weather patterns? How can governments implement frameworks by which climate action is mainstreamed across sectors? And how are communities adapting to this evolving threat? To consider these and related questions, please stay tuned for our live discussion, bringing your comments and questions for our expert panel.
Hello, I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next 90 minutes for this Democracy Forum debate on an issue which has seen world leaders and thousands of others gathering in Azerbaijan for COP29 to discuss a challenge which in some way or another is impacting all our lives. But measures to deal with it move sluggishly, as we're constantly told it will soon be too late to stop it, but always as glaciers melt and temperatures rise, a more immediate crisis seems to take over and command our attention. Our topic today, climate change, South Asia's biggest threat, ? South Asia, 2 billion people, more than 25% of the world's population, from glacier-filled mountain ranges to low-lying, vulnerable coastlines. To discuss this and much more, we are privileged to have an excellent panel of experts: Bhargav Krishna, Benjamin P. Horton, Indu K. Murthy, Anamika Barua, and Mihir Bhatt. Each will speak for 5 to 10 minutes and then be challenged by our audience and myself, with the aim that we emerge with an answer. Is climate change South Asia's biggest threat, or is it something else? If so, what? But before we delve further, I'm going to ask Lord Charles Bruce, President of the Democracy Forum, to lay out the background and canvas of our discussion. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Humphrey. Good afternoon. As the communiques emerging from the recent COP29 United Nations Climate Conference in Azerbaijan remind us, Asia remains the world's most disaster-hit region from weather and climate-related hazards. Dramatic evidence of natural disasters triggered by climate change is fast accumulating across the Indian subcontinent and its neighboring countries of South Asia. So I'm very grateful to Democracy Forum for hosting this event at such a critical time. And I'm delighted that Humphrey has agreed to chair a panel of such an eminent group of experts to address these important issues. An emerging consensus of climate modeling now indicates an impending crisis affecting a core group of frontline South Asian states, principally Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. It's also worth reflecting that the global climate crisis was anticipated almost 30 years ago by the Bangladeshi activist Atiq Rahman. It was at the very first United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1995 that, dismayed by the lack of urgency shown by developed nations, Rahman warned, "If climate change makes our country uninhabitable, we will march with our wet feet into your living room." So it's widely predicted that a rise in temperature for the region of 2 to 4 degrees centigrade within the next 30 years will cause an unimaginable scale of economic damage, resulting from the combined effects of melting Himalayan glaciers, lethal heat waves, increasing cyclonic activity, and coastal flooding. No longer will the impact be confined to peripheral or rural ecosystems, but increasingly it's becoming a fact of life for the majority of the region's city dwellers too. Nowhere is more vulnerable to the frequency of intense heat incidents than the Indo-Gangetic Plain, extending from Pakistan through northern India to the deltas of Bangladesh. With a population estimated at 700 million, but linking the destiny of 3 South Asian states, the plain is fast becoming one of the hottest and most populous places on Earth. And what are the likely economic consequences for the region? By 2030, it's estimated that over 200 million people living in Indian cities will be forced to endure the frequent and searing experience of heat waves, where undoubtedly the impact will fall very unevenly. Fewer than half the households affected are likely to have access to air conditioning. And a study published by Duke University last year concludes that India is already losing 101 billion man-hours per year to heat. And by the same analysis, Pakistan is losing 13 billion hours each year. The McKinsey Global Institute predicts that the loss of outdoor daylight working hours to extreme heat has risen from 10% in 1980 to reach 15% today, and will reach 30% by 2050 in some parts of the subcontinent. It's an inescapable fact that heat-exposed work accounts for 50% of India's GDP and employs 75% of the workforce, or 380 million people. By 2030, the loss of working hours will put at risk 2.5 to 4.5% of GDP, equating to about $150 billion to $250 billion. While Pakistan could lose a higher proportion of its productivity, around 6.5 to 9% of GDP. The Bengali novelist Amitav Ghosh concludes that the challenges presented by climate change will only be met by common commitment and collective action, shared openly, honestly, and evenly between the developed and developing worlds. I quote, "The climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and thus of imagination," he observes. "Even if we make all the necessary changes today, these impacts are upon us. They're unfolding on a day-to-day basis all around us. And that's why it's so strange that we only treat this as something that's projected into the future." Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar today. And if you have any questions or comments for the panel, please pass them through the chair.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce. Common commitment and collective action, is that possible? Or are we all going to have wet feet in our living rooms? Or will we be one of those wet feet? Our first speaker is Dr. Bhargav Krishna, convener and coordinator of the Environmental Governance and Policy Vertical Sustainable Futures Collaborative. His academic career spans Britain, the United States, and India, where he served on union and state government expert committees on air pollution, biomedical waste, and critically polluted areas. He's going to look at the frameworks by which climate action is mainstreamed across all sectors and tell us how governments and communities are adapting to climate events. Bhargav Krishna, share your insight.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hawksley and Lord Bruce, for inviting me to share my perspective on this August panel. Let me set the stage for how climate change is already affecting Indians, not by referring to immediate events that are covered in the news, but through how it's viewed in fiction. In Ministry for the Future, Kim Stanley Robinson places us at the start of his novel in the midst of a devastating heat wave that's crippling Uttar Pradesh and much of North India, where heat thresholds have breached any kind of physiological boundaries that are bearable by human beings, threatening life, livelihoods, agricultural productivity, various other aspects of life. This is a reality that isn't too far away in the future. And in fact, it's something that we're already living through at this point in time. In the last couple of years alone, India has had to deal with extreme heat events across multiple parts of the country over maybe half a dozen times. It has had to deal with glacial lake overflow events in mountainous regions in the country. It has had to deal with landslides, wildfires, storm surges from cyclonic events, as well as coastal erosion that regularly chips away at the coastal boundaries and affects the livelihoods of people living on those coasts. This is just a smattering of the kind of issues that are facing India from a perspective of climate adaptation and climate events. And these events are only projected to get worse going forward under various scenarios with respect to climate change. Even just meeting the Paris Climate Accords, for instance, and the goals set within will likely increase the frequency as well as the intensity of heat waves across a large part of the country. And the diversity of heat experienced across the country, whether it be the desert heat and the dry heat experienced in parts of Rajasthan, or the wet heat and humid heat experienced in coastal South India, means that we are going to have to develop the right kind of framework to be able to address these immediate impacts that are going to be felt through the various climate events that we're likely to experience. The conversation around climate change largely facilitated through fora like the Conference of Parties on Climate Change, which is currently ongoing in Baku, Azerbaijan, has largely focused on climate mitigation, which means reducing carbon emissions at source and preventing various thresholds in terms of temperature as well as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere being breached, such that we would prevent the worst of climate change happening. The reality that we're seeing right now is that this is unlikely to be met. Various countries have rolled back on climate commitments. The changing political winds in Western nations mean that sort of inward view is being taken with respect to national security as well as domestic energy needs. And what this has meant is that it has placed a greater emphasis on developing nations, especially those nations that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, to focus a lot of their energy instead on adaptation. What does it mean to adapt to climate change? That means not just working to address the immediate impacts of a climate disaster that is occurring right now, but planning to address those disasters that we haven't even foreseen the scale of yet coming in the future. A heat wave that is occurring right now, where temperature may breach certain thresholds for 2, 3, or 4 days, may likely breach those thresholds at an even higher level for 10 or 15 days going down in the future. Similarly, for storm surges or for sea level rise. These are the kinds of challenges that we are having to face in dealing with climate events and adapting to those events across vast swathes of India. To speak about this, I'll use the example of heat waves and how India has focused on heat as a vehicle to mainstream climate adaptation across the country. So the first work that was done in this space was in Ahmedabad, in the western part of India, in the state of Gujarat, where a study which noted the impact on mortality from heat waves in 2010 was used as the basis for creating a quote-unquote heat action plan. So what do you do in the event that a heat wave occurs? Which levers of government need to be activated? Who needs to do what to ensure that people, especially those that are most vulnerable, are effectively protected? And how do you ensure that we reduce the impact of this heat wave as much as possible? The work in Ahmedabad proved successful and has been scaled up across many different parts of the country. So to try and understand whether these plans actually are effective in what they aim to do, and whether they even take into account local contexts and plan for the future, my colleagues Aditya Pillai and Tamanna Dalal last year published a piece looking at what goes into various heat action plans. And what we largely saw was that they're cookie cutter plans that copy from each other to an extent, that don't necessarily take into account local conditions when they're planning and implementing adaptation strategies, whether that be tree planting, availability of water, various other resources that need to be made available. None of them have any funding to support the actions that they have laid out. They don't necessarily have any legal foundations. There's no money to support all of these interventions. And lastly, there is no coordination mechanism across government to be able to facilitate cross-sectoral action. And if there's anything that we know about climate change at this point, is that it's not a siloed issue. Climate change is going to affect every aspect of society, every aspect of social welfare policy. And that requires us to approach this from a cross-sectoral lens. And so the way that we have approached this issue of cross-sectoral climate action through the lens of adaptation is developing a framework for the union government called the National Heat Management and Mitigation Framework, which mainstreams climate action across sectors with the goal of trying to embed planning foresight with respect to climate change across all of these sectors. The idea being that if climate is in the room and in the conversation right at the start of policy development, there's a greater likelihood that you will pay attention to it as you're developing policy going forward. Because what is the point of developing a city, a master plan for a city, for instance, that's 15 years ahead, if you're not taking into account what the likely impact is going to be with respect to heat islands, or how water provision is going to be a challenge going forward, or what is going to happen if you have flooding within these cities. These are all realities that we're facing right now, and we're trying to remedy those by bringing climate change much more centrally into the conversation across all of these sectors. The second aspect of what this framework does is recognizes the fact that adaptation to climate change is going to be a deeply local, deeply contextual issue. climate change itself and the carbon emissions and policies associated with it are a global challenge and need global action. But adaptation is a deeply local problem. Just to give you an example, for instance, a colleague of mine went to coastal Karnataka a year ago, where he noticed that locals in a fishing village had lobbied their local politician to construct a seawall outside, just on the boundary of their village, to prevent erosion of their coastline, as a result potentially affecting their livelihoods. Now, this is an immediate example of how adaptation is already occurring. But what they did not realize was that the building of that seawall in front of their village is affecting villages 50 to 100 kilometers further away, where erosion had increased as a result of this wall being built. Now, preventing this kind of quote unquote maladaptation is one of the things that we need to do. But at the same time, recognize that local needs need to be front and center as we design strategies to protect people from the harms of climate exposure and climate events. And what that means is we need to take into account what are local contexts. Are there particular vulnerable populations living in these urban or rural areas that need special consideration? What kind of heat are they facing? What do they need to protect themselves from these heats? Are we looking at populations that are working outdoors and adequately protecting them? So, for instance, workers who are in construction industry, police officers, gig workers who are increasingly the most exposed group across all of these. Are we developing policies that specifically account to their needs? And most importantly, how are we protecting those who are in urban informal settlements as well? Lastly, how we're looking at this is that this is an entry point for talking about climate much more holistically across the board. Mainstreaming climate across all sectors is the ultimate goal of how we would think about approaching climate policy at a national as well as a state level. We believe that addressing climate change has the opportunity to bring substantial co-benefits across the board. You can look at climate change as a threat, or you can look at it as an opportunity. For a developing economy like India, it certainly presents an opportunity in the sense that there are large structural systemic changes that we need to make to adapt to climate change, as well as address climate change from a mitigation perspective. And if we plan effectively enough in advance, there is an opportunity to turn that into an economic win for the country as well. You can see that from the way that India has perhaps approached its question of setting targets for its energy mix, mainstreaming solar and wind as energy sources within its electricity system. It has also taken steps to create international fora to address some of these questions through the International Solar Alliance. The way we want to do that at the national level is by bringing in a new enabling climate law. So the UK already has something to this effect, but largely focuses just on a sort of budgeting exercise with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. We think of climate as a much more development-oriented issue, where we want to mainstream the co-benefits of climate change across sectors by planning and executing in the long term much more effectively. So with that, I'll conclude my opening remarks and I'll hand over back to you, Humphrey.
Thank you so much, Bhargav, Krishna, for that. You've opened our debate, and I'd just like to ballast a couple of things there that you said. You talk about the global action and the chances that things won't be met. And you talked about adaptability. Is this now an acceptance in India, say, that there's not going to be the global action that's needed, that commitment and cooperation that Lord Charles Bruce was talking about, and therefore let's build the seawalls, let's adapt, let's make it opportunity out of this threat?
Absolutely. I think there are two parts to this, right? I think on the global front, the conversation has probably been going on for a couple of years with the interjection of the loss and damage fund and discussions around how do we allocate finances for loss and damage to developing countries. But locally and nationally, I think this is already a thing that is happening. Adaptation is already happening on the ground. People are adapting in various different ways. Farmers, for instance, are already changing the times that they work in. I mean, this is adaptation in practice.
Okay, that's very interesting, because that is not in the mainstream debate, certainly where I am here in London. Also, could you separate off another couple of things that your fellow panelists might agree or disagree with? We have this phrase climate deniers, and then we have the logistics of doing what is necessary to stop climate. That's stop flying in aeroplanes and stop coal-fired Tuesday. Is there sort of three categories there? There are those that actually don't believe in climate change. There are those that are saying, well, we'd love to do it, but we can't. And there are those that are saying, like Gita Thunberg, no planes, no cars, no this and that. Am I right in that categorization?
I perhaps wouldn't be as absolutist as that. Let me say that there probably are three categories. I think there is still a small proportion that are probably climate deniers. There are a large number of climate agnostics. Let's take the example of the United States, for instance, where the most significant expansion of renewable energy capacity, both solar as well as wind, is happening in the red states of Texas and Idaho. This is far beyond anything that any blue state has achieved in the US. So this is seen as an economic issue rather than an environmental issue. There still continues to be, of course, the sort of climate proponents who are taking different stances. And I think the stances that are taken by climate proponents varies between developing countries as well as developed countries. And that's where I think some of the conflict arises here.
Okay. And one question before I let you go from Philip Bowman. It's a basic one, but we should all think about it. Are richer countries in the West, who are the biggest carbon emitters, doing enough to help the countries in the global South? Yes or no?
I think we already know the answer to that question to an extent. I think the commitments made by the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is probably a good step in the right direction, but that kind of ambition is really not mirrored across the majority of the developed world. I think we're probably going to see some level of backsliding with the United States, and that's going to set us back quite a few years in our fight against climate change.
Yes, given that I think I covered my first climate change story 20 or 25 years ago, you say a step in the right direction. You wondered what's been happening over that past 25 years. But thank you very much for that. Stay with us because we will be coming back to you. Our next panelist, Professor Benjamin P. Horton, a director of the Earth Observatory in Singapore, professor of the Asian School of Environment at Singapore's Nanyang Technical University, is going to walk us through the links between climate change and disasters. He actively contributed to the COP26 conference 3 years ago on managing disaster risks from natural hazards in ASEAN. He's also a mentor for the Commonwealth Futures Climate Research Cohort. It's a guide to researchers working towards solutions for climate vulnerable communities. What are the solutions? Professor Horton, tell us what you know.
Thank you. So I'm going to begin with, I don't know how to really start this. I mean, I'm a climate scientist. I've been studying this topic for 30 years. I think my credentials as a climate scientist speak for themselves. I've written 260 peer-reviewed papers on this topic. I was a review editor of the 6th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I and other leading climate scientists are perhaps at their lowest morale that they have ever been. And there are 3 reasons for that. First of all, it's the data. We see extreme events increasing in their frequency and intensity. The Philippines, for example, has been hit by 5 super typhoons in the last month. We saw the devastating consequences of a very warm Mediterranean Ocean causing catastrophic damages in Valencia in Spain. 2 weeks before that, we had successive hurricanes hitting Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. The frequency of these events are directly linked to climate change. Their intensity is directly linked to climate change. 2024 will be the warmest year that any human in any civilization has ever experienced. If you asked me, I think 2024 will be the warmest year in 125,000 years on planet Earth. The second warmest year was 2023. In 2023 and 2024, we burnt and produced more carbon from the fossil fuel industry than we ever have done before. We chopped down more rainforest than we ever have done before. So the data makes a climate scientist incredibly sad and depressed. We know people are losing their lives because society does not does not listen to a climate scientist. When I was an undergraduate student, there was the first intergovernmental panel on climate change in 1990. When I was a PhD student, there was the first conference of parties in 1995, all predicting exactly where climate would go. We always like to say that hindsight is 2020. Well, climate science projections are 2020. In 1990, we predicted that if we didn't do anything about greenhouse gases, you would have an increase in heat, wildfires, droughts. You would have an increase in rainfall, flooding, and landslides. Your ice sheets would melt, your ice packs would go, and sea level would go up. But nothing was done. We currently have a COP meeting. The previous COP meeting in Dubai was supposed to transition away from fossil fuels. So how can we be transitioning when we burn more carbon than we ever have done before? How could it have been the death of the coal industry when Australia produced more coal than it ever has done? So my second reason for the low morale is the absence of action at these COP meetings. Since 1995, the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere since that first COP meeting, if the aim of a COP meeting is to reduce greenhouse gases, since 1995, the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has gone up 60%. So what are we going to get from this meeting? Words? Of course. Action? I very much doubt it. How can we have a COP meeting where the president of that meeting uses his position to broker oil deals? How can you have a COP meeting where there are 5,000 lobbyists from the oil industry? Those meetings are ineffectual, and I feel very, very sorry for the many people who've dedicated their lives to the climate movement, who go to these COP meetings, volunteering, trying to save the planet from disaster. The third reason for a low morale in climate science is the election of Donald Trump. We as climate scientists failed. We did not get climate change on the ballot. We have elected, the US have elected, a climate denier. He is put in charge of energy, a person who does not think climate change is a crisis. Well, you tell that to the people in the Philippines. You tell that to the people in Spain. What are the consequences of the data, the lack of action, and the election of a US president who is a climate denier? Is that we now will cross the 1.5 degrees C threshold. This was at one of the first COP meetings I ever went to in Paris. I was part of a scientific organization which told policymakers that you cannot cross the 1.5 degrees C threshold. But we've done that. What is the 1.5 degrees C threshold? Well, it's a statement saying that the temperatures of planet Earth, the average global temperatures, cannot get 1.5 degrees C warmer than the pre-industrial averages. We stated that as scientists because once you go beyond it, you roll the dice every single day on planetary boundaries. If these planetary boundaries fail, then so does civilization. So everything that has been said by our previous speaker, very distinguished, those adaptations for all those people in India, they don't matter. They're inconsequential. That's what scientists stated, and we were ignored. The 1.5 degrees C threshold, once you go above it, There are a variety of planetary boundaries. You go above the 1.5 degrees C, I'll give you a few of them, I'll just list them off, and they should scare the living daylights out of you. You go above the 1.5 degrees C threshold and 99% of the coral species on planet Earth become extinct. Become extinct. Do you know how many people, if we just want to just ignore the ecosystem that had existed, for example, the barrier reef for 25 million years, if we just don't care about nature, how much of our fish stock that we use to feed ourselves are reliant on breeding grounds in coral reefs? 40%. If you go beyond the 1.5 degrees C threshold, the permafrost in the Arctic melts, releasing more methane than has ever been released through industrial activity, supercharging our atmosphere, causing global mean temperatures of 6 to 7 degrees C above pre-industrial. Again, that never seems that much, but always remember we're a blue planet. So if it's global mean of 6 degrees C, that means that continental areas go up 12 degrees C. And then if we want to think about our urban areas, because we strip out vegetation, replace it with asphalt, that's a 15 degrees C rise. How does Delhi handle that? How does anyone handle that? What else do we want to think about? Well, if you go above 1.5 degrees C, the West Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet become unstable. They have enough water within them to raise global sea levels by about 7 meters. 7 meters. I live here in Singapore. Very, very prosperous island, but a third of its landmass is only 1 meter above high tide. So Singapore becomes the next Atlantis. It's got nowhere to go. Its people have got no escape. If you take yourself above the 1.5 degrees C, the Amazon rainforest that has been the lungs of our planet for over 40 million years becomes a savanna. Last year, the Amazon rainforest emitted more carbon because of the agricultural practices and a drought than it actually absorbs. How can that happen? If you go above the 1.5 degrees C threshold, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, called AMOC, also known as the ocean conveyor, slows down and potentially shuts down. AMOC basically makes the tropics habitable and warms the mid and high latitudes. You shut it down, Europe freezes. And I mean freezes. Stockholm, if you shut down AMOC, Stockholm has a winter temperature of around 2 degrees C. Well, you shut down AMOC and it's -12. It has a summertime temperature of 10 to 12. Shut down AMOC and it never gets above freezing. What do you think the impacts would be on people in northwestern Europe? They're the implications of it. At some point, scientists need to be listened to. Society needs to listen to the experts. We cannot have a COP meeting being chaired by someone who's from the petroleum industry. The COP meetings have to be chaired by a scientist. The climate advisor for every single country needs to be a scientist, not an economist, not a lawyer, not a poli-sci person, a scientist. What I'd implore the people who are listening to us, listening to this podcast or this seminar, is give climate scientists the chance. We dedicate our lives to this business. It's 10 p.m. Well, no, I'll say that's a lie. It's 10:30 p.m. in Singapore on a Monday night. I got married on Saturday, but still, it's more important to me to give this information. I used to use a phrase, and I'll finish with this. I used to use a phrase that if you knew what I knew, you'd be devastatingly scared about climate. And that's not appropriate anymore. It's not appropriate to know that climate change is happening. It's not appropriate to know that humans are responsible. You have to understand the seriousness of these impacts. Give someone like me the chance to find the solutions to this problem, because we're the only people who can. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It was a moving and a chilling account. You talked about solutions. In a nutshell, I mean, let's recap a bit. This issue, as you said, you've been studying it for 30 years. The governments of the world have not come together, have not done anything, and the COP meetings are a complete joke. Your warnings are chilling. There have been disaster movies about it. It's in the back of all our minds. But particularly in the Western world, the democratic world, the next election, talking about the Middle East, about our electric cars, which we're now not getting, about potholes in the road, about our health service and that sort of things. What is your solution for getting this across the line, Ben?
Education.
But you haven't got time. How long have we got before your chilling scenarios unfold?
The fortunate thing is that we still have time.
That's the most
the thing about climate science is it's rapidly changing. When we made our big presentations at the Paris meeting in 2015, we never thought we'd be here less than 10 years later. When I was doing that, I was thinking, well, we're of course going to answer this. We're not going to let the world get away from us on this. It's going to be the top priority. But now we're here. So now we're playing a bit of catch up. If you speak to the leading client, I mean, I've tried to think about that question a lot. And I think it's somewhere, some people say about 5 years, other people say about 10 years. We've got a decade. Let's say you've got about 10 years to solve this. And it is all about education. And what I mean about that is misinformation. You have to get climate change to the top of the agenda, but it's always relegated lower than that, despite there being 80% of people on planet Earth want their governments to do more on climate change. So why don't we have candidates who run on a climate agenda? Because it doesn't need climate change. I've always thought about as not being a negative, because if you solve climate change, you go a long way to solving inequality. And
tell us, since you are in Singapore, which doesn't quite have the day-to-day democratic pressures that there are in Europe and North America, is it at the top of Singapore's agenda? And what are they doing?
Yes and no. If you are a scientist, being in Singapore in climate science is utopia. We are very, very well funded to look at the impacts of climate change to Singaporeans and people in Southeast Asia. If you're in innovation, Singapore is a very good place to be your home if you're trying to think about climate innovation. But if you want action, perhaps not, because it has 98% of its energy is from petroleum. Singapore is just building a new natural gas terminal. So you have an area where, as a scientist, it's terrible because we can see it all because we're funded on it. We have this, Singapore perhaps has the best climate model in the world, because Singapore's very small, so you can't use a global model, you can't use a regional model, you've got to use a local model. And the Singaporean government stated that if we don't do anything about climate change, at least 350 days per year in Singapore would have temperatures beyond the limit of human survivability.
But it's still a fossil fuel, a major fossil fuel. I just want to ask you one quick question. You mentioned the warmest temperatures for 120,000 years at the beginning. What happened 120,000 years ago?
Well, you have natural climate changes. So the Earth's climate is very complicated if you want to get down to a local level, but it's also very simple. It's driven by the Earth's orbit around the sun and how much carbon dioxide you have in the atmosphere. 125,000 years ago, we were a lot closer to the sun. The Earth runs on an elliptical orbit and it changes.
Oh, okay.
The problem about this climate change, is that it's happening really fast, and it's due to human activities from carbon dioxide. 125,000 years ago, we didn't have civilizations on planet Earth. Did we now?
And none of what's happening now is a natural cause. It's all a human cause.
No.
Okay.
No. I mean, I'm asked that occasion less frequently than I was before, because we see it in front of our eyes. So it's observed that it's climate change. People try to deflect or deter and say it's natural variability, but there's a huge field of what's called attribution science that illustrates that these events, and I've done some of this work, these events, since 1990, these events, 90% is due to human activities, and that percentage is only going to go up as we keep on burning our fossil fuels.
Okay, thank you so much for that. We have a question in which all panelists can think about, because I will come back to you on it, but I'm going to move on at the moment. Peter Corner says, what could the re-election of Trump mean for climate issues worldwide? Let's sit on that for a moment. Our next panelist is Dr. Indu K. Murthy, Principal Research Scientist and Sector Head, Climate, Environment and Sustainability at the Center for Study of Science, Technology and Policy in Bangalore. She has been extensively published and has looked deeply into that balance between long-term planning that we've been talking about and the need for immediate crisis management. She knows her science and she knows the vulnerabilities. Indu K. Murthy, give us your arguments.
Thank you, Mr. Hawksley, and thank you, Lord Bruce, for having me here. I'm just going to try to circle back to the topic that we are discussing today, which is basically the question, is climate change really South Asia's biggest threat? So unpacking some of the things that have already been flagged by speakers before, let's just kind of look at Asia as a continent, and then what does science actually say? Ben talked about some of the recent events. Bhargav also spoke about all of the, the latest kind of disasters that every part of the world is talking about. But when you actually look at the long term, definitely we are in a place which we didn't imagine ourselves to be in, whether it is the temperature, whether it is heat extremes, whether it is the marine heat waves. There's been constantly an increase in all of these. And of course, we all know that the glacier melt and the glacier runoff, particularly in the Asian high mountains, have been increasing, and it will continue to increase up to the 21st century. But of course, subsequently, it might decrease, but it's not because we would have done something to fix the problem, but due to the loss of the glacier stock itself. So which is why probably that would kind of reduce. Now, what does increased rainfall, what does glacier runoff ultimately mean? We are talking about relatively increased sea levels, and then of course much faster than the global averages, particularly in the Asian region, with coastal areas being lost and shorelines retreating over time. So in summary, if we do look at South Asia, we're looking at increased risks of extreme weather events, which we're already experiencing both in frequency as well as magnitude. It includes floods, landslides, droughts, cyclones, heat waves, cold waves as well, and of course, rising sea level. Now, the reason why we are worrying about this globally, yes, but when you're looking at South Asia specifically, as Lord Bruce did point out, some of the stats are quite staggering, and you look at the population that's here. We're looking at probably close to 2 billion people residing in one of the most climate vulnerable regions of the world. Now, what are these factors that makes it vulnerable? If you try to look at why we are looking at this particular problem and seeing it as a big threat, is because of the geography and the environmental vulnerabilities. I think, someone already kind of touched upon this, but let me kind of get into some details here. When you're talking about geography, South Asia, interestingly, has the coastal zones, the mountain ecosystems, as well as the riverine ecosystems. So when you're talking of the coastal zones, countries like Bangladesh, India, and the Maldives face threats from rising sea level and storm surges, which we are seeing more and more in the near past. Moving on, when you look at the mountain ecosystems, come to the Himalayan region, which is experiencing accelerated glacial melt, which is disrupting water resources for millions of people dependent on it. River basins, if you're looking at India and the surrounding countries, neighboring countries, be it the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and the Indus, they're all prone to flooding and seasonal variabilities. And let's remember, when you're talking about climate, when you're talking about these natural ecosystems, there are no boundaries, right? So Anamika, who's going to talk later, she's going to be talking about the transboundary risks. But then let's remember, action that's done in one place definitely has a bearing elsewhere, which is why there is a need for consensus. There's a need for action at the global level, while we are also kind of trying to tailor it to meet the local specificities that Bhargav was alluding to. Second aspect that's making this particular region extremely vulnerable is the socioeconomic vulnerabilities. We all know there are existing poverties, inequalities that are already there. So climate change is basically a risk multiplier. It is exacerbating the risk more and more, exacerbating the existing poverty, existing inequality. When you have a region like the South Asia, where 60% of the population approximately is dependent on agriculture, any changes in the climate will have a bearing on the production system and in turn, the livelihoods that are dependent on this particular system. You look at a country like India, there are so many climate sensitive sectors. Agriculture is definitely one. Roughly about 40 to 50% is rain-fed agriculture, which means to say there is no assured irrigation. So obviously, any variability, any changes in the rainfall patterns, in the temperature, whether it is the maximum temperature or the minimum temperature, it would mean that the production, the agricultural crops are going to be impacted. Likewise, fisheries are also kind of impacted. Then you have the forest ecosystem, which deliver a whole bunch of ecosystem services. Now, these are pretty much sturdier as compared to an agricultural production system, but although the gestation periods are larger, there are impacts. I think Ben alluded to the Amazonian forest, where we are seeing losses in carbon because of climate change. So even in a system which is comparatively stable, we are seeing these changes. And whether it is the Himalayan region or in the Western Ghats, we see these changes as well. And people dependent on these particular ecosystems for certain provisional services. It could be food, it could be firewood, it could be certain fruits and nuts, which they actually collect either for subsistence or for marketing. These are all impacted. So, and timber, definitely yes, but there are a whole lot of non-timber forest products which kind of deliver, which kind of feed a population, particularly tribals in many parts of South Asia. So these socioeconomic vulnerabilities get exacerbated because of changes in climate. Thirdly, the largest problem across the globe, and particularly in the Asian region, is urbanization. There is rapid development, rapid urbanization happening in cities like Dhaka, Mumbai, Karachi, even Bangalore, where I'm residing in. And what happens when there is rapid urbanization is that there is increase in exposure to heat stress. Now, the more we build, we are kind of creating more problems. One is, of course, increased material use, which in turn increases the emissions, increases the pressure on the produce itself that has to lend itself for urbanization. And of course, you're also looking at increased heat island impacts in these different cities that are becoming, that are becoming sprawls or compact. Now, each of them come with their own sets of problems, whatever that is. So you need more fossil fuel to be burned because you want to cool them again. Now, heat wave is already a problem and it could be exacerbated. Now, related to this is the health impacts as well. With increasing temperature, with increased heat stress, there are also vector-borne diseases like dengue, malaria, which are likely to increase. And on the other hand, we also have increased water in the system because of flooding, and there are waterborne diseases as well. So there are multitude of health impacts as well that creep in. And of course, air pollution, which is exacerbated by climate change, also leading to respiratory illnesses. The fourth aspect, which kind of increases the vulnerability of the South Asia as a whole, if you look at all the countries is the policy and the adaptive challenges. Let's not forget that these are countries which are still developing. So there is limited financial and technical capacity. Although a lot of work is being done, there's development happening in countries like India. There's been a conscious effort to see how do you integrate climate into the developmental process. So the low carbon development is something that the government of India has been pushing for. Many other countries across the region are also kind of pushing for this. However, there is a need for dedicated technologies, finance for pushing forward this in an accelerated manner. Last but not the least are the disaster management systems. We do have some cities, some places, some regions where it's quite evolved and are able to cope with the current issues or current climate risks. But let's not forget that we are looking at multiplicity of risks within the same region. One part of the year you have a drought, the other part of the year there's flooding. So we're looking at compounding risks. Now, how do you kind of put in place a climate-informed, an evidence-backed, a science information that feeds into the planning process, that feeds into the disaster management? Now, that is the biggest challenge countries in this particular region are facing. Now, overarching all of this is the Asian monsoon, which is like a lifeline for the South and Southeast Asian countries. Now, we all have obviously read in different places or seen news articles where the talk is about weakening of the South and Southeast Asian monsoons, particularly more so it would happen in the second half of the 21st century. Now, as I said, you're looking at climate sensitive sectors. Agriculture is a lifeline for 60% of the population. So which means you are staring at job losses, loss in GDP, because agriculture is one of the primary key sectors which feeds into the economies of many of these South Asian countries. Secondly, in the near term, both the South and Southeast Asian monsoon in this particular region, precipitation changes would be dominated by effects of internal variability. Now, this variability spells doom, particularly where there is rain-fed agriculture that's being practiced. Yes, farmers in different parts of the South Asian region are finding ways to kind of cope with these changes that they are staring at, but these are ad hoc. In some places, there have been certain groups which have been civil society organizations or certain government programs which have been supporting this particular transition. While we do talk about just transition quite a lot in the power sector, but I think food systems are undergoing a lot of transition under a changing climate. So there's a need to kind of see how do you kind of provide that evidence which supports such transitions. So last but not the least, heat waves and humid stress are also a reality in this particular region. And both annual and summer monsoon precipitation is likely to increase, and there could be enhanced interannual variability. So given these large problems, given that climate change could exacerbate the existing inequalities and poverty and health risks, I definitely would argue that it is definitely a big threat, but also, like Bhargav said, an opportunity for action. There's still a window that we can act on.
Thank you very much, Indu K. Murthy. I will get back to you to ask you whether it is the biggest threat or not at the end of the debate. I want to actually put to you a question from Ritesh Nigam that came in. India has one of the world's largest populations, 70% of global population. It only contributes about 4% of emissions. It's also passed its renewable energy targets 5 years ahead of time. If India can manage this, why not others?
Where there is a will, there's a way. So I'm sure there's a possibility of doing it. So, but I think political will and clear action is the way to do it.
So in India, it is a democracy as such. So issues are on the democratic election ballot. Ben Horton's argument or frustration that came through about governments not doing enough, is India leading the way, or is India just one of those governments that's not doing enough?
Well, I would say, there is action, but obviously for a large country like India, which is still developing, what we are doing isn't enough. That's primarily because of the issues that I talked about, the limitations in technical and financial capacities. So yes
Sorry,
and no.
is it enough? I mean, because Ben and everybody talks about this global cooperation. Is it cooperating more than others? Is it, or it's so difficult to quantify this, isn't it?
Obviously, I mean, when you say cooperation, we're talking about everybody acting, and there is always this distributed responsibility and the historical, responsibility that is always there. So obviously, developed countries, and you did touch upon the climate finance, and you posted to Bhargav as well. There have been promises, but then when it comes to delivery, there's always been a shortcome there. So, which is what I think needs to come together. It's not just for India, but for all other countries, the small island states and the LDCs, where this becomes very, very important to actually get action in the right places.
And do you agree with Bhargav Krishna that you must concentrate on adaptability, that Ben Horton thought was perhaps not quite useful, but do you think that is the way through if we don't get this global cooperation?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because I mean, there needs to be, while it's always been mitigation focused, I think adaptation is the need of the hour. Unless we do it, probably we would lose out in our act towards doing something for climate.
Lovely. Thank you so much for that. Stay with us, and we are now going to Dr. Anamika Barua, Department of Humanities and Social Science. It's at the Indian Institute of Technology at Guwahati, with an expertise in the cross-boundary aspects of climate change. She's on the editorial board of Climate and Frontiers in Water, and among her many projects and publications, has a mission to bridge the gap between research and action. What will happen if South Asian countries, many wary and hostile of each other, fail to share and cooperate on climate change? Anamika Barua, tell us your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. Actually, it is easy to come a little late because the context has been already set. So many things that I was thinking of discussing, I can actually skip that. I'm going to take it from where actually Indu stopped. Indu very nicely mentioned about that how climate change will have an impact on various sectors across South Asia. And it was also very clearly highlighted in our presentation that South Asia is not just vulnerable because of its geomorphology, but it is also vulnerable because of its socio-economic situation. And when I'm saying South Asia, it is also very important to understand that we cannot actually club South Asia also as one. There's a lot of differences and differential vulnerability even across South Asia and within India, for example, or within Bangladesh, for example. So what I'm trying to say here is that it is really, really complex. More inequity you have, if your society is more unequal, you cannot really have one kind of policies. So that's why it's a huge challenge for our governments to come up with strategies, which is not something that one is just replicating in another, in another place or in another sector. Having said that, what I want to emphasize today is the transboundary nature of these climate-induced, disasters that we have been seeing, and I want to specifically focus on, transboundary rivers and aquifers, because South Asia is actually home to several significant transboundary rivers, as Indu mentioned, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, Indus, which moves through national boundaries, and it also these are also vital for lifelines for agriculture, energy production, water security, and livelihood security. What we are seeing in the recent, at least for last one decade, we have been seeing that is growing impact of climate change in the form of erratic rainfall patterns, glacier melt, and extreme weather events, which are actually compounding the existing pressure on these shared water resources, and which calls for a more enhanced transboundary cooperation across South Asia. And particularly if you look at unpredictable monsoons and climate-induced extreme events, such as the devastating floods of 2024 in Northeast India and Bangladesh, that actually highlights this challenge. Torrential rainfall caused destruction, not just downstream Bangladesh, but also in India. So both countries suffer. But the point that I want to bring here, and interestingly, what happened during that time is we actually politicized the disaster. And there was a kind of a blame game between the country, within the country and between two countries, that who didn't do what and why this wasn't done. The worry here is that sometimes it is good to politicize certain issues, certain matter, because then it comes to the limelight and you start talking about it. But matters such as disaster, when you politicize it, what happens is that you kind of get distracted from the root cause. And what I feel is that actually happened. Is why all of these disasters happened was because there was a systemic failure, to establish effective early warning system, and timely data sharing mechanism was not there. Like India and Bangladesh and most of the South Asian countries, for example, they do have a mechanism of sharing data. I want to make it very clear, we only share data. We don't share information. And there's a huge difference when you only share data and when you share data and information, both. Now, that's something I'm not going to deal with in detail, but if any question comes, I'm happy to answer that. What is the difference? At the transboundary level, what we see that there is a lack of coordinating data sharing for many rivers, particularly in this case, we saw that the rivers where the floods happened, we are not actually sharing information and data because they are not as big rivers as the Ganges or the Indus or the Brahmaputra. They are tributaries, but we are not sharing information, with each other on these tributaries. So there was a lack of, or I would say, an inadequate cross-border communication. We also heard in the news, and that what happened was that apart from this rainfall that was happening, which was more like a natural phenomenon, but what made it bad or what made it worse was that an automated dam gate, which is in one of the Indian state, it opened. And unfortunately, there was not adequate monitoring, or there was no timely information dissemination, which basically created, a downstream cause. Now, the thing is, it's not just that downstream. When I'm saying downstream, it's downstream Bangladesh. It's also the downstream of India, which suffered. So what you see here is that this blame claim actually holds very little relevance, because at the end of the day, who suffers are the vulnerable communities, because for them, they want a solution to this. So the fundamental actually question remains, have we learned anything from these repeated failures? What is a bit sad to see is that all of these attention, which was there for a couple of months, now isn't there. And what you see, there is still no discussion or no dialogue happening between the countries, between the South Asian countries, that how can we handle these disasters better? This, as one of the panelists also mentioned, that actually climate change is offering us a renewed opportunity to look at these sharing of data and information from a disaster lens. And instead of securitizing this data and making it an issue of national security, it is actually an issue of saving lives and livelihood now. I would like to bring in another concern, and that is the impact of large-scale infrastructure projects. Now, given that we are all talking about climate mitigation, it is a fact that hydropower is going to take the center stage very soon. But the issue is, do we really know, or have we actually done any kind of basin level study to see how it's going to have an impact given the climate-induced disasters that we are seeing? And this is both for floods and drought. And now, given this, what is important to understand that most of these assessments, probably we are trying to look at it only from a country perspective, but we do not know how much water is going to come from upstream and how is it going to have an impact downstream to another South Asian country. So what is important here is to make a paradigm shift towards more collaboration, basin-wide approaches, which is right now we haven't seen that yet, particularly from a disaster lens. Why I'm referring to disaster all the time, because disaster is something which can actually bring these countries together, because everybody suffers equally whenever there is a disaster. And finally, one last point, which is again has not been discussed much, is the intra-regional trade that happens between South Asian countries. Now, why it is important from a climate change angle? Because, we see that we are sharing common resources. It's not just transboundary rivers, but also transboundary aquifer. When one country is, extracting a large amount of groundwater, it is not just depletion for country A, but it's also for country B. So what is important is that so far the trade that is that South Asian countries are engaged in, I'm talking mostly about agriculture trade, most of these are goes outside the region. So we have a better trade relationship with the rest of the world, but not so much within South Asia. And water is kind of invisible. So we do not really see that by doing so, we are actually depleting the shared common resource, as we are not actually exporting and importing among ourselves. But unfortunately, we do not really at the moment have a platform where we can link water and trade. So what is important is to relook at our trade pattern, bringing water along with land, labor, and capital as a factor of production. If we do so, then probably we would know where our comparative advantage lies and what is that where we need to actually specialize more and trade among each other. Now, in all of this, having India as one of the larger economy, of course, the onus ultimately comes to India. But here again, I'm going back to what Indu said. The challenge is that you have a lot to do within your country. So usually you first take your country and then you think about your neighboring country. And for this is why I think it's so important that while at the global forum we are doing a lot of discussion, what needs to be seen is action even at the global level and also within South Asia level. And I somehow feel that probably we need something like hope for South Asian countries as well to come together, meet regularly, and talk about these issues. So I'm going to stop here, and yeah.
Thank you very much. I found as you were speaking there, my frustrations matching those of Ben Horton. And I want to ask you some questions here. You talked about early warning systems, sharing information, data, no data level studied on floods and drought, all this sort of elements here on a topic that we've been aware of for 30 plus years, and goodness knows how many tens of thousands of people are currently at the COP. There's something broken here, isn't there? Just to sum up what is broken in this system, in that the people on this panel have been studying this for many years. You are all experts, yet the mechanisms for fixing it are not put in place.
Well, unfortunately, whether it is climate change, whether it is disaster, whether it is sharing information, when you politicize them, it becomes a very different ballgame altogether. What you actually see today is that every country, for example, India is talking about adaptation in a transboundary river, but you are only looking at your part of the river. But even your adaptation will fall short if you are not bringing the countries from where the water is coming, right? So that is one thing. The other thing is that, what we say that, think globally, but act locally. And that really, really is so important. You need to actually start thinking that how do you ensure, in spite of so much talk, in spite of so much of technological advancement, so on and so, we are still not able to, save the vulnerable. So I think that's where one focus that is missing.
Sorry, are these South Asian countries, are they cooperating on other things at a far higher level, but not on these disaster and climate change issues?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you really see what happened in this recent flood, it's so centralized. The system is so centralized. The data sharing mechanism is so centralized that the how would I put it? The subnational level, there is no connection mechanism. It's a matter of phone call. You make a phone call downstream and you can save a lot of lives and livelihood, isn't it? But that doesn't happen. And one point that I want to add, which I didn't mention, is that I still feel that even disaster is looked from such a technocratic aspect. You forget that you are actually dealing with people. So when you do that, when you have a very technocratic approach, we have a right system in place and it will work, it doesn't work. What needs to be understood is for whom are you developing it? there was a criticism within Bangladesh also that early warning was issued. Nobody could understand what it means because the language was so difficult to understand.
Oh, goodness.
So this is something, and this is across South Asia, and I'm not going to speak about any other country. And I think these are some of the issues which are so small. We go for big issues, but we do not try to resolve smaller concerns.
Yeah, so you've got all these people at the COPs, but they don't know what it's like to be on a riverbank that's about to flood. A question from Prashant Kumar, which goes to what we're talking about. Would better infrastructure help South Asia withstand some of its more extreme climate events? Is that the adaptability that we've been talking about?
Well, actually, I think, of course, infrastructure, what infrastructure are we talking about? If we are talking about flood regulating infrastructure, you can never get it correct if you do not look at it at the basin scale. It's going to be really, really disastrous if we are not looking into how much water, and the most important thing, including climate information into it. Today, you may see this is the design for this much of water, or this much of rainfall. Tomorrow, that rainfall pattern may change. So given that, how are you going to ensure that your designs are correct? You can have infrastructure, but just blindly having an infrastructure will not work. You have to be well informed what infrastructure and whether it is going to last for next 20 years or 40 years or 50 years. One last point I wanted to add here, Humphrey, is that interestingly, even IPCC report does not talk about transboundary issues. And that is very sad. You don't see transboundary anywhere in IPCC report.
Are you of Ben Horton's apocalyptic view, or do you believe that through increasing adaptability, let's assume that the world does not come together, because I think this is a theme that's coming out. Will the human race survive if it adapts?
I think yes, but one thing we have to remember, there is a limit to adaptation as well. Somewhere, we also have to make sure we can't go on adapting. There has to be a point where we also have to stop, whatever is happening for which we are adapting has to stop. But we can divide this responsibility. It is not fair that one adapts, one mitigates everything, and one only is mitigating. There's a larger, definitely responsibility, large with the developed world, to help the developing countries to adapt and mitigate to climate change. And that remains the bottom line for everything.
Okay, thank you. I just have to tell the panel and our audience, Mihir Bhatt, who is apparently in Azerbaijan at the moment, has not been able to join us. So we have got more time to discuss things. So I'm going to put a question out there that has come in that Ben Horton alluded to, and let's drill it down a bit, because the solution, he said, should be education. Let us go to Bhargav Krishna on this one. From Anand Tomar, should climate change education be implemented into school curriculum in South Asia and more widely? And if so, how? Bhargav Krishna?
Thanks so much, Humphrey. I just to sort of echo Ben's sentiments. It's not that we don't all feel the same way about climate change, nor that we don't necessarily believe that science needs to be central to how we approach this policy-making approach. It's just trying to work within practical realities of politics and political structures within governments here, and how we are trying to understand and implement solutions. As for climate change education, I think it's absolutely fundamental that we do this from early stages of schooling. I don't think it appears anywhere near early enough in sort of school curricula. And more importantly, let's say, even as somebody who works within the public health sector, it doesn't appear anywhere within the medical curriculum. We have a lot of physicians who have absolutely no knowledge of climate change, of environmental exposures, including air pollution and how they affect health. And so we're dealing with a problem for which the majority of our population has really no understanding of the consequences. They may experience it in day-to-day living in various ways, as we've already outlined, through, say, coastal erosion, storm surges, heat waves, droughts, various other aspects in which they are actually already adapting to the impacts of climate change, but they don't understand the scientific basis, nor do they understand what they need to do to sort of either play their part or call on politicians to be able to do their part better.
I just want to pick you up before we go to Benjamin Horton on this. I mean, given that you're in India, is there any other issue that's like a long-term issue, seen as a long-term challenge, that does capture the headlines and people do things about it? I'm thinking of Narendra Modi's housing, or building toilets, or building airplanes, or something like that, that actually is moving, whereas the climate issue stays still?
I think there's a lot of things that appear to be moving, let's say. I think whether it be sort of social welfare programs like construction of toilets, houses, road infrastructure, various other aspects, provision of gas stoves for rural households, which are traditionally reliant on wood or coal or dung for cooking and heating. These are all important levers that have been moved over the last decade, but I think we still have a long way to go. But I think the context that's necessary here is with respect to how well India is doing and what India needs to do, needs to be sort of simultaneously framed within the argument that India still has some 300 million people living in extreme poverty. We still have 150 million undernourished in this country. We have left parts of this country where infant and maternal mortality rates are comparable to sub-Saharan Africa. At the same time as the rest of the country is developing, and you have this wide gap of inequality that is a feature of society. And so how do you juxtapose these two issues simultaneously? And how do you develop in a way that's equitable but also addresses climate needs is the fundamental question that we're facing right now.
Yeah, so is climate change the biggest threat? Ben Horton, you must be, why are you still doing this job? You must have got frustrated 10 or 15 years ago, from what I've just heard.
I mean, why do I do this job? Because I've got 3 kids. So I take that comment as a little bit of an insult. I'm a dad, and the most important thing in my life is that my children have a healthy and a happy future. And if we don't stabilize this climate, they won't. So I'm never going to give up. The second thing I would say is it's my job, and I'm fortunate. I'm sat in an air-conditioned apartment. I don't have to be a construction worker who's going out in Singapore working in 34 to 36 degrees C with a humidity of 70 or 80%. You know, climate change is really serious, guys. I mean, again,
excuse me. I don't think anybody on this panel thinks it's not serious. What we're trying to do is move things on. I don't think anybody's disputing what you're saying, but Anand Tomar said, should climate change education be on the school curriculum? And if so, how? You said that education was the solution. Could you perhaps bring that out a little bit more?
Well, I mean, you know, when we started off at the Earth Observatory of Singapore, so the Earth Observatory of Singapore was set up as a research centre of excellence to create a capacity within Singapore and Southeast Asia for climate science. So how do you do that? Well, you change it at the school level. So when we were formed in 2008, the first thing we did was work with the Ministry of Education here in Singapore to change the curriculum. So all school children were then educated on how the Earth works. We then needed to find an undergraduate school for those 18-year-olds who were excited about studying climate. So we created the Asian School of the Environment. Then you get the very best of those undergraduates and you create a graduate school. And then when we've been to our COP meetings, we still go to our COP meetings. We don't particularly talk about the science because we're rather disillusioned about that, but we talk about education. So we go there with our knowledge capsules for undergraduate and high school education, and we've translated them into different languages, and we give them freely to our developing neighbours. And so we're trying to do our bit because we do think that education is key. But I am worried, a little bit like if we're thinking about a democracy forum, we're very worried about democracy, particularly in the United States. I'm also, and with the erosion of the free press, I'm very worried about climate change in education, because the people who are going to be culpable on climate change are going to be governments and big business, and they're going to shut down any discourse in education that puts the blame at their feet. And we need to hold the line on this.
Okay,
we need to hold the line.
Let's take that point in Indu Murthy, is the is the freedom to discuss climate change in India or in the wider world, according to that question. What more should be done in the educational curriculum to address this issue?
Freedom to discuss climate change definitely exists, which is why policy think tanks like what Bhargav works for or I work for are still operational within India. So we do work on these, and also we are also kind of part of these committees which inform the government in in the way policies need to be made. So basically, we develop the science and evidence which feeds into the policy making. So there is a discourse, there is a communication that happens. I'm not saying whatever we say just gets picked up blindly, but yes, that's there. With respect to education, I think we still have a long way to go. Now, of course, to me, I would say educating the politicians is as important as educating the next generation students, while they have to be aware. The other is also about, when you say education, it's not just about building awareness, it's also about building skills that are required in a climate changed world. The kind of technologies, the kind of maybe buildings that need to be built, right? So these are going to be very different. So are we equipping the next generation engineers maybe, and like Bhargav said, the doctors who have to kind of cope with increasing heat risk? Are they able to recognize these signals, or are they still sitting with their traditional textbooks which didn't talk about these issues? So yes, there is a need for education at multiple levels and on multiple aspects.
So, and how does that, because we just heard from Bhargav Krishna about the 3 million in poverty, the toilet building and this sort of thing. How does that become prioritized in the way that Ben Horton thinks it should be?
Well, I mean, at least in India, the top priorities are the developmental priorities. And like I mentioned right in the beginning, the government of India is finding ways in looking at how do you go low carbon, how do you integrate resilience building and adaptation into these developmental programs. Now, that said, there are action plans that are being built at the subnational levels, at the state level. And there are some progressive districts also which are kind of doing, or some cities which are developing these action plans. So there's a lot of parallel action that's happening. But what would be important is, while at the global level there's a need for concerted action, even within countries, even within regions, I think there's a need to kind of have a platform to learn lessons from, and also kind of piggyback on experiences, similar experiences that are had.
You raised an interesting point there, but before I move on to Anamika Barua on this, is that this mix of priorities, and then we heard from Anamika that, stuff that just hasn't been done, basic stuff like sharing information about floods and that. Give us your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, yes to that, primarily because I think if you ask me, climate change is a communication problem largely. I say this in every forum I'm in. We have the data, we have the evidence. Ben talked about it at length. He's worked on it for 30 years. So have all of us in this group. But the thing is, are we actually speaking the language that makes sense to the people in the decision-making positions? Are we actually kind of passing on the information in forms which aids decision-making? There's more and more shift and transition towards these aspects, at least in the spaces that we work in here. But I think that it needs to happen seamlessly and much more in an organic manner.
Okay, and according to Ben Horton, we have 5 to 10 years. And Anamika Barua, I want to start you with the final question. Is the Trump from Peter Cornish? What impact will Trump's re-election have on global and South Asian climate challenges?
Okay, so of course there will be some impact because we are looking at one of the powerful leaders. But I think it is also important to understand that it's not the end of the world. It doesn't mean that Trump coming in power means that what we are doing is going to change, or what each country is doing is going to change. What is important here is to remember is that so you have this question, climate change, South Asia's biggest threat, whether I will be able to come back to that or I don't know. So I want to tell you one thing here. I think it's not, climate change is not the biggest threat. The biggest threat is generating political willingness to act and remove, to settle this problem, to understand how important this problem is, as Ben was mentioning. And I think creating that political willingness, even bringing this to Trump's mind, is the biggest challenge, is the threat. So if we can do that, then yes, it is something which humanity is seeing, but we have a way out. But one thing is that we have to have the willingness to do. So that is. Yeah.
Thank you. No, that's a fascinating distinction. So thank you for that. The biggest threat is actually communicating the message to the politicians. Indu K. Murthy, Trump's re-election, what is the impact?
I mean, it's no doubt bad news, but let's remember that no one can run from the climate crisis. So obviously, US is also seeing more and more of these. So obviously, I think, yes, we also know that there are parts of US which is doing a lot. But that said, I think all of the countries will need to step up. In our own countries, we are doing, but I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. Waiting for one country to actually lead or motivate is not going to help. And it's happened in the past, and work continued. So I'm hopeful, and I'm kind of pretty optimistic that things will move.
Okay, thank you. And yes or no, is climate change the biggest threat to South Asia?
Well, I do think it's a big threat because it's, as I said, a threat.
Not the biggest though.
Maybe not, but I would kind of, yes, agree with Anamika that political will is the biggest threat. Now that she said it, yes.
Okay. Benjamin Horton, Trump's re-election, the impact, you did say that 5 to 10 years, he's going to be there for 4.
Well, Trump's impact, the Biden administration, stroke the Harris administration, was on course for a 40% reduction in type 1 and type 2 emissions of carbon dioxide. That will be reversed by Donald Trump. Donald Trump's administration in Project 2025 suggests that a minimum 4 billion tons of carbon will go into our atmosphere. So his impact is absolutely massive. It, as I stated in my comment, it takes us over the 1.5 degrees C threshold. So what Donald Trump does influences every single person on planet Earth. Unfortunately, we didn't run on an agenda in that election on climate change. Yeah. We don't run on an agenda in any election on climate change. Despite everyone on this panel and 80% of people on planet Earth wanting our governments to do more, we don't run on that. And we need to be very clear why that doesn't happen. And that happens because of misinformation from the petroleum industry. We have to get very real with what they have done over the last 30 years.
That's it. Thank you very much.
And do you want to, can I just finish, is climate change the single biggest threat?
Yes.
Of course it is. It's a civilization killer.
Yeah. But
we
also,
just to say, like, we have had regional wars. We've always had regional wars, and society has recovered from them. We've had pandemics. We've always had pandemics. Civilization has never had a climate crisis. And I know exactly where we're heading if we don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It is the biggest threat, and sometime, somewhere, someone's going to listen to a scientist.
Thank you for that, Bhargav. Krishna, could you begin open for us? Could you close for us Trump's re-election, and is it the biggest threat?
Look, I probably lie somewhere between the optimism of Dr. Indu Murthy and the sort of perspective of Ben Horton on what the impact of this is going to be. I think it's primarily going to come down to economic considerations. As much as Trump will do in terms of putting new carbon into the atmosphere and withdrawing from the Paris Accords and various other aspects that are going to occur, the choice is very much down to economic considerations at this point. It's much cheaper to install new solar and new wind than it is to open new thermal power plants anywhere in the developed world. It isn't economical anymore to invest in coal mining in the same way as that's the case here in South Asia as well. As for whether South Asia's biggest threat is climate change, I would probably I would probably sort of equate it to a global nuclear conflict akin to something you described in one of your novels somewhere.
We will end with that. Nuclear conflict is a word, but thank you. What a discussion! Really good and sort of challenging views there on the nail for the current climate conversations. Thank you, Bhargav, Krishna, Benjamin P. Horton, Indu K. Murthy, Anamika, Barua, and thank you, Democracy Forum team, for bringing together such a revealing debate. Our next debate is Thursday, December the 12th, at the same time and equally critical. Does China's influence diminish in a multipolar world? That'll be a great discussion. Hope to see you there. And please check out our sister magazine, Asian Affairs, that deals with issues like this that are often missed in the mainstream media that we heard in the discussion today. Until then, from all at the Democracy Forum, thank you for being here and goodbye.